in the darkened neighborhoods of Brooklyn, where being loyal was like having money in the bank and betraying your friends meant you would end up dead. A single man climbed up from nothing to become the most dreaded leader the Colombo family ever knew. But Carmine, the Snake, Persico's whole empire would not be destroyed by gunfire or by people turning against him. It would be destroyed by his very own flesh and blood. Before we jump into this unbelievable true story that covers 70 years of gangster life, I really need to know where on planet Earth you are watching from right now, and what time the clock shows where you sit. Put your location down in the comment area below, and we will see just how spread out this crowd of viewers really is. If you are pumped up for this complete look inside the brain of the sneakiest crime boss America ever produced, smash that subscribe button right away and give that notification bell a solid tap. Take my word for it. You are absolutely not going to want to miss even the tiniest piece of what unfolds next. And here is the deal. If this story totally blows your mind the way I am sure it will, pass it along to somebody who eats up true crime tailies. Because stories this amazing are way better when you share them. He never squeezed the trigger on the shot that turned him into a legend. He never went against the unwritten rules that controlled his entire universe, and he never lived long enough to see the sidewalks that had shaped him into who he was. Yet Carmine the Snake Persico turned out to be more lethal locked up in a prison cage than the vast majority of men ever are when holding a pistol. This here is the account of America's final mafia chieftain. A guy who showed the whole world that the sneakiest serpents are the ones you never spot heading your direction, until way after you should have noticed them. The man who had once led an entire army of hitmen, who had pumped terror into the chests of enemy crime clans, who had controlled a crooked fortune worth millions while shut away inside the toughest federal prisons, was now simply another ID number in the government lockup system. But the tale of how Carmine Persico transformed into the snake and how he slithered his way upward to sit at the very peak of one of America's most brutal gangster families is a story that stretches across almost 7 full decades of organized crime. Here in the United States, let us get started. August 8th, 1933. The thick, sweaty heat of summertime pressed down hard over the Red Hook part of Brooklyn, where the salty, fishy smell coming off the harbor got all mixed up with the scent of garlic, oregano, and hopelessness that soaked into the cramped apartment buildings packed tightly together. Inside a small, plain 2-bedroom flat on President Street, Carmine John Persico Sr. walked back and forth, nerves eating him alive, while his wife Susan pushed and strained to deliver their very first son into the world. The Brooklyn of 1933 was a big mixing bowl filled with dreams, brought by immigrants and promises that turned out to be fake. The Great Depression had settled down over the entire borough like a heavy, dirty fog, squeezing off every chance to make a living and pushing guys who played by the rules to start playing dirty. For the Italian families who had run away from being broke and from political chaos back in the old country, America was supposed to have roads paved with solid gold. What they actually discovered were roads covered with busted glass, where staying alive usually meant picking between going hungry and breaking the law. Carmine Sr. loaded and unloaded boats at the docks when there was any work at all. His rough, cracked hands told the story of endless hours hauling cargo on and off ships at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, fighting hard for whatever daily wage he could grab just to keep his expanding family from starving. But the honest jobs were few and far between, and the bills just kept piling up. Like a whole bunch of guys in his part of town, Carmine Sr. every now and then added to his pay by doing things that were not exactly legal, running numbers for the lottery, moving stolen merchandise, doing whatever small jobs he could for the men who always seemed to have cash when everybody else was completely broke. When tiny Carmine Jr. arrived that August morning, he was born into a community where the dividing line between what was right and what was wrong had already started to get fuzzy. The Persico family made their home in a neighborhood where people earned respect by being tough, where Italian immigrants had rebuilt the same kinds of power structures they thought they had left behind across the ocean, and where little boys figured out early that sometimes hitting and hurting was the only language certain people could understand. The Red Hook, where Carmine spent his childhood, was an entire world completely cut off from everything else, separated from the rest of Brooklyn by giant factory walls and by huge gaps between rich and poor. The area was ruled by the wars where thousands of men battled each other for work. That might last a single day or might stretch out for whole season depending on how the shipping, chedules, lined up and how much the crooked union bosses decided to play fair, running right alongside the normal businesses, the tiny grocery stores run by families, the hair-cutting shops, the private hangout spots for men. There was a secret economy that was doing very well. It was run by guys who got respect by scaring people, and whose spoken word was the only law that mattered out on the sidewalks. By the time Carmine was old enough to stand up and walk, he was already soaking up the teachings of the world around him. The neighborhood children created loose gangs that were divided by which street corner you lived on and what nationality you were. Even the play areas at the elementary schools followed secret rules about whose territory was whose and how you had to act to get respect. Young Carmine was not very big for his age, but his brain worked fast, and he was absolutely terrified of nothing. These qualities would turn out to be extremely useful for him in the years that were coming. As Carmine moved into his teenage years during the late 1940s, Brooklyn, after the war, was going through major changes. The soldiers had all come back home. The economy was climbing out of the hole it had been in. But the pecking order in the neighborhoods stayed exactly the same. If anything, it had gotten even more locked in place. The guys who had survived the fighting, both overseas and on the home front, had shown how tough they really were, and they were absolutely not about to let some young punks who thought they were big shots push them around. Carmine was 15 years old when he got his very first genuine taste of planned-out group violence. It was a sticky, damp summer night in 1948, and bad feelings had been boiling up for weeks between the Italian kids from President Street and a bunch of Irish troublemakers from just a couple of blocks over. The whole thing had started over, something that did not really matter. A girl, money owed from gambling, somebody saying something insulting, but it had blown up bigger and bigger according to the strict, unwritten rules of street punishment that controlled the lives of teenagers in Red Hook. The brawl happened in an empty space behind a warehouse that nobody used anymore, with about 50 kids making a big, loose ring around the guys who were going to fight. Carmine was not the biggest kid there, and he was not the strongest either. But he had something that the guys he fought against did not have. He was not scared of anything at all, and he was willing to go way further than anybody expected him to. When the Irish kid he was fighting pulled out a knife, most kids would have backed off or screamed for their friends to jump in. Carmine just grabbed a broken bottle and smiled. The fight did not even last 5 minutes, but it built Carmine's reputation from that night on. He did not just win the fight, he completely took over. He thought everything through beforehand. He waited calmly. He let his opponent mess up first, and then he attacked with the kind of accuracy you see in a surgery. The rest of the kids started calling him the Snake. It was not just because he was sneaky or clever, even though those traits were definitely part of it. It was because of the way he could keep himself totally still, totally patient, and then blast into action faster than lightning when the exact right second showed up. Word about the fight traveled through the neighborhood gossip network and reached the ears of men who made their money by judging talent and spotting potential. By 1949, Carmine had pulled the attention of older, more established lawbreakers who noticed something unusual in the quiet, super-focused teenager who had picked up such a terrifying reputation among kids his own age. It was during this time that Carmine got connected to a loose bunch of young troublemakers known as the Garfield Boys. They were named after the nearby park where they usually met up and hung around. The Garfield Boys were not really a gang the way people normally think of one. They were more like a practice field for young guys who wanted to eventually join the more serious, better organized crime groups in the neighborhood. Running the Garfield Boys was a charming, completely crazy guy named Frankie the Bug Abadamarco, who was already in his early 20s and had connections to big-time organized crime players. Learning from Frankie, Carmine picked up the fundamentals of the illegal business. How to run the numbers lottery, how to sell stolen items without getting caught, how to squeeze money out of people who really did not want to pay, and most importantly, how to zip his lips shut when the police showed up and started asking questions. But Carmine was not the same as the other Garfield Boys. While they were perfectly happy just following directions and taking their tiny cuts of whatever crooked deals they were involved in, Carmine was studying the entire operation from a distance. He watched the way Frankie set up their jobs, the way he handled relationships with older, more influential criminals, the way he settled arguments and kept control inside the group. Carmine was soaking up knowledge about the business of crime, not just the part where you beat people up. The activities of the Garfield Boys grew bigger and more serious throughout 1949 and 1950. What had started as teenage fooling around and stealing small stuff turned into much larger criminal operations. Grabbing trucks and stealing everything inside, holding up stores, and every now and then working as hired muscle for guys who loaned money at huge interest rates or bookies who needed debts collected or competitors scared off. Carmine took part in all of these operations, but he was also starting to show the leadership skills that would eventually turn him into one of the most influential organized crime figures in the whole United States. Carmine's very first serious brush with violence, as something more than just a street fight, went down in the winter of 1950. The Garfield Boys had been hired by a local bookmaker to collect money owed by a small-time gambler who had been ducking his payments for months. The gambler, a middle-aged guy named Tony Brusher, owned a tiny restaurant nearby in Carroll Gardens and had been using his legal business to cover up the money he was losing on bets. Brusher had made the error of thinking he could cheat his bookie because he had connections to a different, competing crew that might be able to shield him from trouble. He was wrong. When Carmine and two other Garfield Boys walked into his restaurant on a quiet Tuesday evening, they discovered Brusher all by himself, counting the cash he had taken in that day behind the bar. What went down next would be argued about in neighborhood stories for years and years. Based on some stories, Brusher reached for a gun and Carmine was just protecting himself. Based on other stories, Carmine shot a man in cold blood to deliver a warning to anybody else who might be thinking about dodging their debts. The real truth, just like it usually does in situations like this one, probably sits somewhere in the middle of those two versions. What nobody argues about is that Tony Brusher died that night and Carmine Persico walked away without even a scratch. More importantly, he walked away with the respect and the focused attention of men who actually had power in the neighborhood pecking order. the teenager who had picked up his nickname, the Snake, during a street brawl, had shown he was capable of killing when the situation demanded it. This was a qualification that swung open doors in the world he was absolutely determined to enter. Right when Carmine was starting to plant himself as a serious contender in Brooklyn's underground world of crime, history stepped in wearing a uniform. It came in the shape of the Korean War. Early in 1951, when Carmine was 17 years old, his draft notice arrived in the mail. For most young men in his situation, serving in the military would either be a nice escape from a life of breaking the law, or a frustrating interruption of a promising criminal path. For Carmine, it turned out to be something completely different. It became a school that taught him about structure, self-control, and large-scale violence. Lessons that would come in extremely handy during the years ahead. The Army had no idea what to do with Private Persico. His drill instructors noticed right away that he had natural leadership instincts and an almost spooky ability to stay completely calm when everything around him was chaos. But there was something about him that made them feel uneasy. He did exactly what he was told, no questions asked. But you always got the feeling that he was judging those orders, deciding whether they made good sense, and storing away information about how the military was set up and who was in charge, stuff he might be able to use later. Carmine's time in the service took him to Korea during some of the worst combat of the entire war. He served as a ground soldier in the 2nd Infantry Division and was part of several huge battles, including the awful fighting at Heartbreak Ridge in the fall of 1951. The experience of being in combat, having to make split-second decisions that meant life or death, needing to work well inside a super-organized team while under unbelievable stress, the reality of ending other human beings' lives as just part of the daily routine. All of this gave Carmine abilities and ways of looking at the world that would pay off big time in the career he had picked for himself. But maybe even more important than all that, serving in the military gave Carmine his very first taste of being a leader in a system that was actually legal. His natural smartness and complete lack of fear, mixed together with his skill at making fast decisions when the pressure was on, got him promoted to sergeant very quickly, for the very first time in his whole life. He was working inside a structured environment where moving up the ladder was based on how good you were at your job, not on who your family knew or how tough people said you were on the street. This was a lesson he would keep in his mind when he went back to Brooklyn and started putting together his very own criminal organization. The Korean War also showed Carmine a much bigger world outside the tiny, cramped box of Red Hook. He fought alongside guys from different backgrounds, different ethnic groups, different social classes. He figured out that the exact same qualities that made somebody dangerous on the sidewalks of Brooklyn, thinking fast, having no mercy, being able to make people follow you because they were scared of you and respected you. Those same qualities were just as valuable on battlefields halfway around the planet. When Carmine got back to Brooklyn, late in 1952, he was not the same promising young tough guy who had left 2 years earlier. His time in the military had given him self-confidence, order, and a wider view of how to organize people and how to lead them. More importantly, it had given him time to really think about what he wanted to do with his future and what he aimed to achieve in his life. He had made up his mind. He did not want to spend his whole career just being another soldier fighting in somebody else's army. The Brooklyn that Carmine came back to in 1953 had shifted while he was gone, although maybe not quite as dramatically as Carmine himself had shifted. The economic boom after the war was really picking up steam, bringing new money to a lot of neighborhoods, but also creating brand new chances for organized crime. The old-school rackets, the numbers lottery, loaning money at sky-high interest, controlling labor unions. They were all bringing in more money than ever, but they were also getting more complex and more crowded with competition. The old-time neighborhood bosses who had run Brooklyn's criminal world for decades were getting older, and younger guys with big ambitions were starting to get themselves in position to move up. The Persico crime family, which controlled most of the illegal action in Brooklyn and out on Long Island, was dealing with its own internal shakeups. The boss, Joseph Persico, was locking down his power and searching for dependable young men to help him grow his operations even bigger. Carmine's reputation had only gotten stronger while he was away serving his country. Stories about what he had done before the war had been stretched and made into legends while he was gone. And him coming back as a soldier with medals for bravery added a whole new layer to his street credibility. But more than that, Carmine had come home with a much sharper picture of what he was capable of and what he wanted. He was no longer satisfied with just being another hard guy in a neighborhood stuffed full of hard guys. He wanted to create something of his own. Joseph Persico was one of the most powerful and successful organized crime bosses in the entire country. He was born in Sicily back in 1897, moved to the United States in 1921, and put together a criminal empire that stretched way beyond the usual mafia rackets. Persico ran a completely legal olive oil and cheese importing business that gave him both a stream of clean money and a perfect cover for his illegal operations. This earned him the nickname the Olive Oil King. By the early 1950s, the Persico organization controlled most of the organized crime activity in Brooklyn, large parts of Long Island, and sections of New Jersey. Persico's crew was much more disciplined and ran more like a real business than a lot of its competitors. This reflected the boss's own background as a successful, legal businessman. He demanded loyalty, skill, and secrecy from the men under him, and he paid those qualities back very generously. Carmine's entrance into the Persico organization came through his connection to the Garfield boys and his growing name as somebody who could be counted on for tricky, sensitive jobs. His very first official task came in 1954 when he was told to help fix a fight between two different groups inside a Brooklyn longshoremen's union. This disagreement was threatening to stop work at several important docks and could have cost the organization thousands of dollars in lost revenue. The job demanded exactly the type of abilities that Carmine had built up during his years on the streets and his time in the military. The ability to look at a complicated problem, pick out the main players and what they wanted, and put together a plan to get the result they needed while keeping violence and public attention to an absolute minimum. Carmine's answer was beautiful in how simple it was. He tracked down the leaders of both sides, set up private meetings with each of them, and made it absolutely clear that if they kept fighting, there would be consequences that neither group wanted to deal with. The dispute was patched up in less than a week, and Carmine's position inside the Persico organization climbed higher because of it. Even more importantly, this job had shown off his talent for thinking ahead, strategically, and fixing issues without depending entirely on hitting people and scaring them. These were exactly the characteristics that Joseph Persico valued most in his men, and they flagged Carmine as somebody with the potential to move way up inside the organization. One of the most important connections that Carmine built during his early years inside the Persico family was with the Gallo brothers. Joseph, who everyone called Crazy Joe, Larry, and Albert, who everyone called Kid Blast. The Gallos controlled a significant crew inside the Persico organization and had already planted themselves as serious heavyweights in Brooklyn's criminal ranking system. The Gallo brothers were a study in opposites. Larry was the oldest and approached things like a businessman, focusing on the family's traditional rackets and keeping up relationships with other crime families. Albert was the youngest and the most violent, earning his nickname because he liked to use dynamite and other explosives in his criminal work. But it was Joseph, Crazy Joe, who grabbed the most attention and would eventually play the biggest part in Carmine's career. Crazy Joe Gallo was everything that traditional mafia bosses were absolutely not supposed to be. He was loud. You never knew what he would do next. And he seemed to not care at all about the low-profile approach that most organized crime guys preferred. He partied with celebrities, artists, and brainy types, and he had a gift for pulling media attention that made his higher-ups extremely uncomfortable. But he was also incredibly smart, completely without mercy, and he inspired fierce dedication from the crew that worked under him. Carmine's relationship with the Gallo brothers began as a simple matter of needing to work together. They were assigned to cooperate on several projects for the Profaci organization, but it quickly grew into something much more complicated. Carmine admired how ambitious the Gallos were and how willing they were to push back against the old way of doing things. But he was also smart enough to see the serious dangers in the way they operated. This relationship would turn out to be one of the most important, and in the end most destructive, connections of Carmine's entire career. During the middle of the 1950s, Carmine started to build himself up as a major moneymaker for the Profaci organization. His illegal operations during this period were varied and advanced, showing off both his growing experience and his planned-out approach to organized crime. One of his most profitable operations involved a well-organized system of grabbing trucks that were carrying very expensive goods to and from Idlewild Airport, which is now called John F. Kennedy International Airport. This operation demanded careful preparation, dependable tips about shipping schedules and what was inside the cargo containers, and the ability to quickly move stolen merchandise to establish networks of people who bought hot goods. Carmine's time in the Army turned out to be priceless when it came to setting up these operations. He applied the same step-by-step method to planning and carrying them out that he had picked up in the military. The truck hijacking operation was incredibly advanced for its time period. Carmine had cultivated sources inside the trucking companies and even inside the airport itself. These people passed along information about shipments that were especially valuable. His crew would intercept the trucks at spots they had carefully chosen, usually very early in the morning when there was hardly any traffic and police patrols were spread out too thin to respond fast. The stolen merchandise would be transported to warehouses in Brooklyn and Queens, where it would be sorted, repackaged, and then moved through a web of completely legal and sort of legal businesses. But Carmine's operations were not limited to the usual organized crime activities. He also started to build what would later be identified as one of the earliest advanced credit card fraud schemes in American criminal history, working together with dishonest bank workers and using methods that would not become commonly known until many decades later. Carmine's crew was able to create millions of dollars in fake charges using stolen and forged credit cards. The success of these operations brought Carmine to the personal attention of Joseph Profaci himself. The aging boss was very impressed by the young man's intelligence, his discipline, and his ability to pull in money. He began assigning Carmine tasks that were increasingly important and extremely sensitive. By 1957, Carmine had been officially brought into the Profaci family as a made member. This was a ceremony that marked his change from a promising associate to an established member of one of America's most powerful organized crime families. November 25, 1957, the barbershop inside the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan was usually very quiet on a Wednesday morning. There was only the soft snipping of scissors and the gentle murmur of conversation between the barbers and the customers sitting in their chairs. Albert Anastasia, the dreaded boss of what would later become the Gambino crime family, settled down into his usual barber chair for his weekly shave and haircut. He had no idea that this ordinary visit would be his very last one on Earth. Anastasia was known throughout the organized crime world as the Lord High Executioner because of his Roll-Running Murder Incorporated. This was the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate that had carried out hundreds of hired killings during the 1930s and 1940s. He was one of the most feared men in all of America, a boss who ruled by spreading terror and who had survived many attempts on his life through a combination of extreme ruthlessness, constant paranoia, and plain dumb luck. But on this morning, his luck finally ran out. While Anastasia relaxed in the barber chair, his eyes shut tight, his face covered with hot, wet towels, two gunmen walked calmly into the shop. What happened next took less than 30 seconds, but it would echo through the organized crime world for decades to come. The gunmen, their faces partly hidden by scarves and hats, opened fire with .38 caliber revolvers. They pumped 10 bullets into Anastasia while he struggled to get up out of the chair. The boss who had ordered the deaths of hundreds of other people died exactly the way he had lived. Violently and without any warning at all, the gunmen walked calmly out of the shop, disappeared into the crowds on the Manhattan streets, and were never officially identified or arrested for years afterward. The assassination of Anastasia stayed as one of organized crime's biggest unsolved puzzles. Law enforcement agencies launched enormous investigations, chased dozens of possible leads, and came up with many theories about who had ordered the hit and who had actually carried it out. But the real truth stayed hidden inside the code of silence that controlled the entire criminal underworld. Many decades later, though, sources inside organized crime families would reveal that the assassination had actually been ordered by Joseph Profaci and carried out by members of his organization. This included a young, ambitious-made man named Carmine Persico. According to these stories, Carmine was one of the gunmen who walked into that Park Sheraton barbershop that morning and helped wipe out one of the most powerful bosses in the entire history of American organized crime. The Anastasia hit served many different purposes for the Profaci organization. It eliminated a rival boss who had been moving into Profaci's territory and interfering with his business interests. It showed other organized crime groups who might be thinking about similar moves exactly what the Profaci family was capable of. And it established Carmine Persico as somebody who could be trusted to carry out the most sensitive and dangerous jobs there were. For Carmine personally, being part of the Anastasia assassination was a moment that defined his whole criminal career. It proved that he could be trusted with the organization's most important business. It showed how cool he stayed under extreme pressure and how he could carry out complicated operations without making a single mistake. And it built his reputation throughout the larger organized crime community as somebody to be respected and feared. The success of the Anastasia operation and Carmine's continued success as a moneymaker for the Choose XS, as a moneymaker for the Yents Profaci organization led to him moving up very quickly inside the family hierarchy. By 1958, he had been raised to the position of capo, which is also called a captain. This gave him control over his very own crew and responsibility for a big portion of the family's operations here in Brooklyn. Carmine's crew was not like a lot of the traditional organized crime groups. Instead of putting all their energy into just one type of illegal activity, his operation was spread out across many different enterprises. Hijacking trucks, loaning money at high interest, running illegal gambling, taking cuts from labor unions, and various kinds of fraud and extortion. This variety gave them both more potential to earn money and better security. If one operation ran into problems, it did not necessarily mess up all the others. But maybe even more important than that, Carlin's crew was known for having an unusual amount of discipline and organization. Reaching back to what he had learned in the military, Carmine set up his operation along military-style lines. There were clear chains of command, specific areas that each person was responsible for, and systematic procedures for planning and carrying out criminal activities. His soldiers knew exactly what was expected from them, and they knew that failing to meet those expectations would bring serious consequences. This method turned out to be extremely successful. By 1959, Carmine's crew was bringing in more money for the Profaci family than a lot of operations that had been running for decades. His success earned him increasing respect inside the organization and also started pulling attention from law enforcement agencies that were getting better and better at understanding how organized crime worked. But success also brought new problems and new people who wanted to bring him down. Other capos inside the Profaci organization started to resent how fast Carmine was moving up and how much influence he had with the boss. Rival families began to look at his operations as competitive threats that needed to be taken out. And most ominously of all, the Gallo brothers. His old allies and friends were starting to develop their own plans for grabbing power inside the Profaci organization. The late 1950s represented the high point of Carmine's early criminal career. He was still only in his 20s, but he had already planted himself as one of the most successful and feared organized crime figures in New York. He controlled a sophisticated criminal business that brought in millions of dollars every single year. He had the respect of the people at his own level and the confidence of the men ranked above him. And he had earned his reputation as the Snake through his demonstrated skill at striking fast, efficiently, and without any warning when the situation demanded it. But the very success that had lifted Carmine up to this position was also creating the conditions for the fights and betrayals that would shape the next part of his career. The organized crime world of the 1960s would turn out to be way more violent, chaotic, and unpredictable than anything he had gone through while climbing to power. And the relationships and partnerships that had helped him so much during the 1950s would be tested by pressures that would eventually tear the Profaci organization completely apart and reshape the entire landscape of American organized crime. By 1960, Joseph Profaci's criminal empire was worth tens of millions of dollars and employed hundreds of people in various legal and illegal businesses. But underneath the surface of this obvious success, pressures were building up that would soon explode into one of the most violent and destructive internal wars in the whole history of American organized crime. The source of these pressures was sitting in a major conflict between Old World Sicilian traditions and New World American ambitions. Profaci, like many bosses from his generation, believed in keeping extremely tight, step-by-step control over his whole organization. He demanded complete loyalty from the men under him, insisted that every single major decision had to be cleared through him personally, and required that tribute payments be sent to him from every criminal operation that was working under his protection. But many of the younger members of the Profaci organization, especially the Gallo brothers and the guys who ran with them, were frustrated by all these restrictions. They had built successful criminal businesses through their own intelligence and bravery, and they resented having to give up big portions of what they earned to an aging boss who seemed less and less in touch with how modern organized crime actually worked. The specific incident that set off the war was actually pretty minor, but it brought together years of built-up resentments and competing ambitions. In late 1959, the Gallo brothers had been promised control over several very profitable gambling operations in Brooklyn and Queens. This was supposed to be their reward for successfully completing various jobs, including their part in the Anastasia assassination. But when the time came to actually hand over control of these operations, Profaci decided to give them to different members of his organization instead. He gave various technical reasons for changing the plan. For the Gallos, this betrayal represented way more than just a disappointment in business. It was a complete violation of the agreements that governed their entire relationship with the Profaci organization. They had put their lives and their freedom on the line to carry out Profaci's orders, and they expected to be paid back appropriately. When those payments were held back, they started to question whether their loyalty was being returned by the man who was supposed to be their leader. Carmine Persico found himself stuck in a position that kept getting more and more difficult as tensions climbed higher throughout 1960. His connection to the Gallo brothers went back years, and he had worked closely with them on many successful operations. But his main loyalty belonged to the Profaci organization, and to Joseph Profaci personally. Profaci was the man who had given him the opportunities that made all his success possible. As the disagreement got more intense, Carmine tried to act as a go-between for the two sides. He respected the complaints the Gallos had, and he understood why they were frustrated with Profaci's bossy, my way or the highway style of management. But he also recognized that open rebellion against the boss would absolutely lead to violence and total chaos. This could destroy everything that all of them had worked so hard to build. February 27, 1961. The morning started out like any other morning for several high-ranking members of the Profaci organization. Joseph Magliocco, Profaci's underboss and his brother-in-law, left his home in Brooklyn for what he thought was going to be a routine meeting at a social club down in Red Hook. Frank Profaci, the boss's younger brother, got ready in a similar way for what should have been an ordinary day of handling family business. But this day was going to be anything but ordinary. When these men arrived at their different destinations, they were not met by business associates. Instead, they were met by armed men, wearing masks and carrying weapons. Within just a few hours, 4 of the most important figures in the entire Profaci organization, Magliocco, Frank Profaci, Captain Salvatore Musacchia, and soldier John Simone, had been grabbed and were being held in secret spots scattered all over Brooklyn. The kidnappings were the Gallo brothers' way of declaring war on Joseph Profaci. Instead of just accepting the boss's decision to take away the gambling operations they had been promised, they had decided to force a renegotiation using the most direct method they could think of. The message was simple and clear. Give us what we want, or your most important lieutenants will never be seen breathing again. The sheer boldness of this operation shocked the entire organized crime community. Kidnapping made members of your own crime family was practically unheard of in the American Mafia. It represented a violation of the traditions and codes that had controlled organized crime for generation after generation. Other bosses watched nervously to see how Profaci would respond. They all knew that the way he handled this crisis would have effects on their own organizations too. For Carmine Persico, the kidnappings represented a moment of truth that he had really been hoping to avoid. The Gallo brothers were forcing every single member of the Profaci organization to pick a side and staying. Neutral was no longer an option. Even though he had personal relationships with the Gallos, and even though he understood some of their complaints, Carmine made the decision that would end up defining the rest of his entire career. He stayed loyal to Joseph Profaci, and to the established order of the organization. The negotiations that followed were tense and complicated. They did not just involve the people directly in the conflict. Representatives from other crime families also got involved because they were worried about the example being set. Eventually, they worked out a compromise that got the kidnapped men released. In exchange, the Gallos got certain things they wanted, including control over some of the gambling operations they had originally been promised. But this temporary fix for the kidnapping crisis had not actually solved the underlying problems that had caused it in the first place. If anything, the success of their incredibly bold move had convinced the Gallo brothers that Joseph Profaci was weak and could be pushed around. They figured that putting on more pressure might get them even bigger prizes. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Both sides started getting ready for the larger conflict that now seemed absolutely certain to come. The Profaci-Gallo War that really got going in late 1961 would continue, sometimes more intense and sometimes less. For nearly 3 full years, it would take dozens of lives, mess up criminal operations all over Brooklyn and Queens, and completely change the structure and culture of American organized crime. The war was marked by a level of violence and unpredictability that was unusual even by the standards of organized crime. Traditional mafia conflicts usually followed certain unwritten rules. You generally avoided going after regular people who were not involved. You left family members alone. There were understood limits on what kinds of weapons and tactics were considered acceptable. The Gallo War broke a lot of these conventions. Both sides used more and more extreme measures as they tried to get an advantage over their opponents. Carmine's part in this conflict had many different sides to it, and it was crucial to the Profaci side eventually winning. As one of the family's most capable and ruthless capos, he was responsible for putting together and carrying out many of the operations against Gallo strongholds and the people connected to them. His military background turned out to be extremely valuable when it came to planning complicated operations. These required coordination between multiple crews and careful timing so that law enforcement would not show up and interfere. But Carmine's most important contribution to the Profaci cause was his ability to keep discipline and morale high among the organization's soldiers during a period of extreme stress and uncertainty. The war had messed up traditional criminal businesses and created constant danger for anybody even associated with the family. Leaders who were not as skilled might have watched their crews fall apart or switch over to the enemy side. But Carmine's combination of strategic intelligence, personal magnetism, and his willingness to share the same risks as the men under him kept his operation intact and effective throughout the entire conflict. One of the most important early battles of the war happened in August 1961. Larry Gallo was tricked into coming to a meeting at the Sahara Lounge in Brooklyn. They told him it was for peace talks. The meeting was actually a trap set up by Profaci loyalists, including Carmine. They had found out about Gallo's plans to attend, and they saw their chance to take out one of the rebellion's key leaders. The assassination attempt almost worked. Gallo was choked with a rope and left for dead in the back room of the club. The only thing that saved his life was a police patrol showing up unexpectedly because they were answering a completely different call. This failed hit had several important results. It wiped out any possibility of negotiating a peaceful end to the conflict. It showed the Gallos that their enemies were willing to use trickery and betrayal as weapons. And it cemented Carmine's reputation as somebody willing to take huge, unusual risks in order to get what he wanted. As the war dragged on through 1962 and into 1963, both sides started using more and more advanced and violent methods. The Gallo brothers, cut off from their usual sources of money and soldiers. Started recruiting from outside the traditional Italian-American organized crime community. They brought in Irish, Jewish, and African-American criminals who were willing to work for cash instead of the promises of moving up in the organization later on, which was what motivated traditional mafia soldiers. This new approach gave the gallows certain advantages in battle. Their new recruits were not known to Profasci's intelligence networks, and they were willing to take risks that more experienced criminals might have avoided. But it also created new weaknesses. These outsiders were not tied down by the traditional codes of silence and loyalty. When they eventually got caught, they turned out to be much more likely to give in to pressure from law enforcement. Carmine and the Profasci loyalists answered with new ideas of their own. They created new methods for gathering information about gallows operations and new techniques for carrying out strikes against targets that were well protected. Carmine's crew got especially good at using surveillance and sneaking people inside to find weak spots in gallows hideouts. Then they would attack those exact weak spots with perfectly planned strikes that kept the risk of getting caught or facing retaliation as low as possible. One of the most successful of these operations happened in the spring of 1963. Carmine's intelligence network found a warehouse in Red Hook that the gallows were using to store weapons and stolen merchandise. Instead of just attacking the place directly, Carmine put together a much more complicated operation. He coordinated with crooked police officials to make sure that a real, official law enforcement raid would happen at the exact perfect moment. This would cause the maximum amount of damage to gallows operations, while keeping the risk to his own people as low as possible. The raid was a devastating hit against the gallows forces. It removed huge quantities of weapons and illegal goods, and at the same time, it revealed the locations of several safe houses that the authorities had not known about before. Even more importantly, it showed Carmine's growing skill at using corrupt law enforcement contacts as weapons against his enemies. This was a tactic that would become more and more important to him later in his career. June 6, 1962. After more than a full year of warfare that had taken dozens of lives and messed up criminal operations all through Brooklyn, the conflict took an unexpected turn. Joseph Profasci died of liver cancer at Southside Hospital in Bay Shore, Long Island. The boss who had built one of America's most successful criminal businesses over 4 decades did not die from an assassin's bullet. He died from natural causes that no amount of money or power could do anything to stop. Profasci's death created an immediate problem about who would take over the organization. According to traditional mafia rules, leadership should have passed down to Underboss Joseph Magliocco. He was Profasci's brother-in-law and his longtime second in command. But a lot of people thought Magliocco was weak and had trouble making decisions. He did not seem to have the intelligence or the ruthlessness that were necessary to lead an organization. That was right in the middle of an active shooting war. Carmine found himself in an increasingly important position as the family's leadership structure changed to fit this new situation. His success during the early stages of the Gallo War had marked him as one of the organization's most capable and reliable leaders. His combination of street credibility and strategic intelligence made him an extremely valuable advisor to the new administration. But this leadership crisis also created new chances for the Gallo brothers. They saw Profasci's death as an opportunity to negotiate a good end to the conflict. They reached out to other crime families and argued that the war had been a personal fight with the man who was now dead. There was no reason, they said, for the bloodshed to keep going under new leadership. These approaches created splits inside the Profasci organization. Some people wanted to negotiate a peaceful settlement. Others believed that the gallows needed to be completely wiped out before they could threaten the family's stability ever again. Carmine was firmly on the side that wanted to keep fighting. He argued that any compromise that left the Gallo brothers alive and free would just push the fighting off until later. It would not really solve anything. Joseph Magliocco's time as boss of what was still called the Profassi family lasted less than 2 years. But it was a period of major importance for Carmine's career development, with the organization still fighting a scattered war against the Gallo brothers and facing more and more pressure from law enforcement. Magliocco came to depend heavily on his most capable subordinates to keep control and discipline inside the ranks. Carmine's influence inside the organization grew significantly during this period. He was asked for his opinion more and more often on major decisions. He was given responsibility for some of the family's most important operations. He was allowed to expand his own crew so they could handle additional responsibilities. In many ways, he was already acting as an unofficial underboss. He just did not have the official title yet, and he did not have the complete authority that usually came with such a position. But it was during Magliocco's time as boss that Carmine first started to develop the management style and organizational philosophy that would define his later leadership of the family. He believed in keeping tight control over the men under him while also giving them enough freedom to develop their own criminal operations. He insisted on discipline and loyalty, but he also rewarded people who were good at their jobs and came up with new ideas. Most importantly, he understood that successful organized crime operations needed the same kind of careful planning and step-by-step execution that made successful legal businesses work. But Magliocco's leadership of the family was damaged from the very beginning by his involvement in one of the most ambitious and ultimately disastrous plots in the entire history of American organized crime. In late 1962, he started developing a plan. Reportedly, after talking with Joseph Bonanno of the Bonanno crime family, to assassinate several rival bosses and completely reorganize the whole structure of organized crime in New York. The plan was breathtaking in how huge it was and how incredibly bold. Magliocco and Bonanno apparently thought they could wipe out Carlo Gambino of the Gambino family, Thomas Lucchese of the Lucchese family, and Stefano Magaddino of the Buffalo family. Then they would split up the territories and operations of these dead bosses between themselves. If this scheme had worked, it would have made them the two most powerful organized crime figures in all of America. Carmine was asked to take part in this assassination plot, but his response showed exactly why he had become so valuable to the organization. He said he was willing to follow orders, but he also raised serious questions about whether the plan could actually work and what the likely consequences would be if it succeeded or if it failed. His analysis turned out to be exactly right when the intended targets found out about the plot. This discovery created a crisis that would eventually end Magliocco's leadership and completely reshape the entire Profasci organization. The discovery of this assassination plot against rival bosses created a crisis that had never happened before inside the American Mafia. The men who were supposed to be killed, Carlo Gambino, Thomas Lucchese, and Stefano Magaddino, were all powerful and well-connected leaders. They commanded serious resources, and they had eyes and ears throughout the entire organized crime community. Their response was fast, and it was harsh. They demanded that the Commission, which was the governing body of American organized crime, investigate the plot and punish the people responsible. The Commission trial of Joseph Magliocco in late 1963 was a turning point in the history of American organized crime. Never before had the leader of a major crime family been called to answer for his actions in front of his fellow bosses in such a formal and public way. The proceedings, even though they were conducted in total secrecy, sent shockwaves through the entire criminal underworld. They established new rules that would influence how organized crime was governed for decades after. Carmine's role in this crisis was complicated, and it was crucial. As one of Magliocco's most trusted subordinates, he knew all the details of the assassination plot and the internal discussions that had led to it being developed. But he had also expressed doubts about whether the plan was wise, earlier than almost anyone else. This meant he was seen as somebody who had not just blindly followed along with a dangerous and ultimately self-destructive scheme. When Magliocco was called in front of the commission to answer charges that he had broken fundamental rules about how crime families should treat each other, Carmine was among the lieutenants who went with him. Watching his boss get humiliated and eventually forced to step down gave Carmine incredibly valuable knowledge about how organized crime worked at its very highest levels. And it reinforced what he already believed. Success in this world required careful calculation and strategic thinking. It was not just about being bold or wanting power really badly. The commission's verdict was devastating for Magliocco personally, but in the end, it was good for the long-term stability of the organization. He was stripped of his leadership position, fined a huge amount of money, and basically forced into retirement. More importantly, the commission appointed Joseph Colombo Sr. as the new boss of what would now be called the Colombo crime family. This marked the end of the Profaci era and the beginning of a completely new chapter in the organization's history. Joseph Colombo Sr., being raised to the leadership of the family in 1963, showed both continuation and change in how the organization was developing. Colombo had been a member of the Profaci organization for a very long time, and he had stayed loyal during the Gallo War. This had proven that he was a reliable and capable leader, but he also brought new ideas and new approaches that would significantly change how the family operated and how the public saw it. For Carmine, Colombo's rise to power was both an opportunity and a challenge. The new boss recognized Carmine's abilities and how much he had contributed to the family's success. He was willing to give Carmine more responsibilities and more freedom to run his own operations. But Colombo also had his own vision for what the family should become. That vision did not always line up with everything Carmine thought about how the organization should be managed. One of the biggest changes Colombo made was putting much more emphasis on public relations and political influence. Unlike the bosses who came before him, who had preferred to stay in the shadows and avoid any public attention, Colombo believed that organized crime figures could and should take more active roles in their communities and in the wider political process. This approach reached its peak when Colombo formed the Italian-American Civil Rights League in 1970. On the surface, it was a completely legal organization dedicated to fighting discrimination against Italian Americans. But really, it was a vehicle for advancing organized crime interests through political methods. The League organized rallies, pressured politicians, and even managed to push the federal government into removing the word mafia from official documents and press releases. Carmine was suspicious of these activities from the very start. His instincts told him that attracting public attention was dangerous for organized crime figures. It did not matter if their causes seemed completely legitimate or how fancy their public relations campaigns were. He preferred the traditional approach of operating quietly and invisibly, building power and influence through fear and respect, not through media events and political organizing. But even though they had these differences in philosophy, Carmine's relationship with Colombo stayed strong all through the 1960s. The new boss appreciated Carmine's skill and his reliability. He gave Carmine more and more authority over the family's most important criminal operations. By the end of the decade, Carmine had been promoted to the position of Underboss. This made him the second most powerful figure in one of America's most important organized crime families. The Gallo War officially ended in 1963 with the death of Joseph Profaci and Joseph Colombo taking over as boss. But scattered violence and tensions continued for several more years. The Gallo brothers had survived the conflict, but they had been significantly weakened by years of fighting. They were no longer in a position to directly challenge the family's leadership. Larry Gallo died of cancer in 1968. This removed one of the most capable and strategic minds from the anti-Profaci faction. Albert Gallo gradually faded into relative obscurity. He focused on small-scale criminal activities instead of trying to rebuild the kind of organization that had made the brothers so dangerous back in the early 1960s. Only Joseph "Crazy" Joe Gallo remained as a significant threat, and even his influence was much reduced from what it had been at the peak of the conflict. For Carmine, the end of the Gallo War was both a personal and a professional victory. He had stayed loyal to the organization during its most difficult period. He had played a crucial role in its eventual victory, and he had been rewarded with more power and more responsibility. His reputation within the larger organized crime community was now completely solid. His future prospects inside the Colombo family seemed to have no limits. But the war had also taken something from him. Years of constant tension and violence had hardened Carmine in ways that would have long-term effects on his personality and his approach to leadership. He had learned to see loyalty and betrayal as absolute ideas with no gray areas. He had learned to respond to challenges with overwhelming force. He had learned to trust only those people who had proven themselves through shared danger and common goals. These lessons would help him a lot in the increasingly complicated and dangerous world of organized crime in the true 1970s and beyond. But they would also contribute to the isolation and suspicion that would eventually define his later years. This was when the very qualities that had made him so successful as a young criminal would become disadvantages in a changed world, where the old rules did not apply anymore. The 1960s had transformed Carmine Persico from a promising young criminal into one of the most powerful and feared organized crime figures in America. The decade that started with him as an ambitious capo in somebody else's organization ended with him as the underboss of a major crime family. He had his own vision for how that organization should operate and his own plans for its future development. But the next decade would bring new challenges that would test all of his skills and everything he had learned over the years. The 1970s would see more law enforcement pressure than ever before, new types of criminal opportunities, and internal fights that would eventually change the entire landscape of American organized crime. And right at the center of all these changes would be Carmine the Snake Persico, a man who had already proven his ability to survive and thrive in a world where the stakes were literally life and death. June 28, 1971. Columbus Circle in Manhattan was packed with activity as thousands of Italian Americans gathered for the second annual Unity Day rally organized by the Italian American Civil Rights League. The crowd was full of happy energy. Families enjoying food from vendors, live music playing, and speeches celebrating Italian American heritage and accomplishments. Right in the middle of it all was Joseph Colombo Sr. He was the crime boss who had transformed himself into a civil rights leader, and he was now speaking to his supporters from a platform set up in the shadow of the statue of Christopher Columbus. But somewhere in that crowd that day, there was a man who had not come to celebrate. Jerome Johnson, a 24-year-old African-American man from New Jersey, had somehow gotten himself press credentials and worked his way close to the speaker's platform. Just as Colombo started his speech, Johnson pulled out a .25 caliber automatic pistol and fired 3 shots from basically point-blank range. The first bullet hit Colombo in the head. The second hit him in the neck, and the third hit him in the shoulder. The boss who had built his whole reputation on being able to navigate dangerous situations and outsmart his enemies had been cut down right in front of thousands of witnesses by a gunman whose reasons for doing it stayed a mystery. Johnson was tackled immediately by Colombo's bodyguards and security people. But in all the confusion that followed, somebody, and the identity was never officially determined, shot and killed Johnson before he could be questioned for Carmine Persico. The shooting of Joseph Colombo was both a personal tragedy and a professional opportunity. As underboss of the family, he had been at the rally and had seen the attack happen with his own eyes. Watching his boss lying in a pool of blood, surrounded by panicked regular people and security personnel who were totally ineffective, just reinforced what he had believed all along. Public attention and political activism were dangerous distractions from the serious business of organized crime. Colombo survived the immediate attack, but he would spend the remaining 7 years of his life as basically an invalid. He was paralyzed and could not speak clearly. He was just a shadow of the charismatic leader who had built the Italian-American Civil Rights League and commanded one of New York's most powerful crime families. His effective removal from active leadership created an immediate empty space at the top that would have to be filled quickly to prevent the kind of instability that had hit the family during the Profaci-Gallo transition. Within hours of the shooting, the remaining leaders of the Colombo family had made a decision that would turn out to be one of the most important in the organization's history. Carmine Persico would serve as acting boss, while Colombo was unable to lead. This appointment made sense from several different angles. Carmine was the official underboss. He had shown his skill and his loyalty over many years. He commanded respect from both the family soldiers and the larger organized crime community. The transition also represented a fundamental shift in the family's character and its approach to criminal enterprise. Where Colombo had been flashy and eager for publicity, Carmine was secretive and methodical. Where Colombo had looked for legitimacy through political activism and community involvement, Carmine believed that power came through fear and that being visible was a disadvantage, not an advantage. One of Carmine's very first decisions as acting boss was to immediately break up the Italian-American Civil Rights League and pull the family out of all public political activities. The organization that Colombo had seen as his greatest achievement was quietly dissolved. Its money was given out to various legitimate charities. Its membership was allowed to just drift away. The message was completely clear. Under Carmine's leadership, the family would go back to traditional organized crime methods and priorities. But Carmine taking over as leader also happened at the same time as a period of law enforcement pressure on organized crime families all across the United States that had never been seen before. The federal government had started to take organized crime seriously as a threat to national security. New laws, new investigation methods, and new resources were being used against mafia families with more and more success. The RICO Act, which stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, was passed by Congress in 1970. It gave federal prosecutors powerful new tools for attacking the organizational structure of crime families. Instead of just prosecuting individual criminals for specific crimes they had committed, under RICO, just being a member of a criminal organization could itself be considered a crime. Prosecutors could use evidence of a pattern of criminal activity to ask for severe penalties against entire leadership structures. For somebody in Carmine's position, RICO was both a new challenge and a new opportunity. The law's focus on organizational leadership meant that bosses and underbosses were more vulnerable to prosecution than they had ever been before. But it also meant that effective leaders who could keep discipline and security inside their organizations would have significant advantages over their less competent rivals. Carmine's method of locking down his power inside the Colombo family showed the strategic intelligence that had defined his entire criminal career. Instead of just demanding loyalty and obedience from the family's capos and soldiers, he systematically worked to make sure that their financial interests were lined up with his leadership and that their personal safety depended on the family continuing to be stable under his direction. One of his most effective strategies was reorganizing the family's criminal operations to make them both as profitable as possible and as secure as possible. Traditional activities like running numbers, loaning money at high interest, and taking cuts from labor unions were restructured to lower the risk of law enforcement getting inside, while also increasing the income that was generated for family members. New opportunities in drug dealing, credit card fraud, and stock market manipulation were carefully evaluated and only pursued selectively when the potential rewards were worth the risks involved. But Carmine's most important innovation was his organized, step-by-step approach to gathering intelligence and blocking enemy intelligence. He reached back to lessons he had learned during the Gallo War and from watching law enforcement methods. He created what was basically a private spy service inside the Colombo family. He had sources inside law enforcement agencies, inside rival crime families, and inside legitimate businesses that might provide useful information about threats or opportunities. This intelligence network allowed Carmine to stay ahead of law enforcement investigations, predict moves by rival organizations, and spot potential problems within his own family before they could grow into serious threats. It also made his reputation for being able to see around corners and predict developments that caught other leaders by surprise even stronger. These qualities enhanced his mystique as the Snake and strengthened his position inside the organization. How effective these approaches were became obvious pretty quickly. Even with increased law enforcement pressure and the disruption caused by Colombo's shooting, the family's criminal operations kept running profitably and efficiently throughout the early 1970s. More importantly, the organization kept the internal discipline and loyalty that had been threatened during previous leadership changes. The relative stability that Carmine had achieved inside the Colombo family was disrupted in early 1972 by the return of Joseph Crazy Joe Gallo from prison. Gallo had been serving a 10-year sentence for extortion, and he had used his time behind bars to plan his comeback and rebuild his network of allies and associates. His release represented the return of the one significant threat to Carmine's leadership that was still around from the conflicts of the 1960s. Gallo's method of challenging Carmine's authority was just as unconventional and unpredictable as he was. Instead of trying to rebuild the same kind of traditional Italian-American crew that had been defeated in the earlier war, he started recruiting heavily from African-American and Hispanic criminal organizations in Brooklyn and Harlem. This strategy gave him access to manpower and resources that were mostly unknown to Colombo family intelligence networks. It also let him operate in neighborhoods and criminal markets where the family did not have much of an established presence. This new Gallo organization was also more ruthless and unpredictable than the old one had been. The non-Italian criminals that Gallo recruited were not tied down by traditional mafia codes and customs. They were willing to use tactics that broke the unwritten rules that had previously controlled organized crime conflicts. Things like random violence against regular civilians, attacks on family members, and even cooperating with law enforcement when it helped them achieve their goals. For Carmine, Gallo's return was both a personal and a professional challenge that needed to be handled decisively. Any sign of weakness or hesitation in dealing with this threat could weaken his authority inside the family and encourage other potential challengers to test how serious he really was. But at the same time, going back to the kind of open warfare that had marked the early 1960s would absolutely attract law enforcement attention and mess up the profitable criminal operations that were the foundation of his power. Carmine's solution was just as strategic and methodical as always. Instead of immediately responding to Gallo's provocations with overwhelming violence, he started a careful campaign to isolate his enemy and cut off his resources. Using his intelligence network, Carmine identified the key figures in Gallo's organization and systematically targeted them for elimination or neutralization. He also used his relationships with other crime families to make sure that Gallo would not receive outside support for his challenge to Colombo family authority. April 7th, 1972, 5:30 in the morning. Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy was winding down after another busy night, serving people who stayed out late. Theater crowds and the occasional celebrity looking for authentic Italian food in a place with good atmosphere. The restaurant was known for staying open late and attracting a mixed group of customers that included both regular, law-abiding people and figures from the criminal underworld who appreciated that the place was discreet and had an old-time feel. Joseph Crazy Joe Gallo had chosen Umberto's as the spot to celebrate his 43rd birthday with his new wife, her daughter, his sister, and his bodyguard. It was a typically flashy choice for a man who had always enjoyed being seen in public and who seemed to believe that his celebrity status gave him some protection against his enemies. The party had been going on for several hours. Gallo was holding court at a corner table, entertaining his guests with stories and jokes while keeping one eye on the restaurant's entrances and exits. But at 5:30 in the morning, Gallo's luck and his instincts both failed him at the same time. A single gunman walked calmly through the restaurant's front door, approached the table where the birthday party was happening, and opened fire with a .38 caliber revolver. Gallo was hit multiple times and died almost instantly. His blood splattered across the checkered tablecloth and mixed with the leftovers of the birthday celebration. The assassination was perfectly executed from a tactical standpoint. The gunman had entered and exited the restaurant quickly and efficiently, leaving no witnesses who could provide useful descriptions to law enforcement. The weapon was never recovered, and no arrests were ever made in connection with the killing. Most importantly, the murder sent a completely unmistakable message to anyone else who might be thinking about challenging Carmine's authority. Defying the Colombo family leadership would have fatal consequences. Even though Carmine was never officially charged or even publicly suspected in connection with Gallo's murder, law enforcement agencies and organized crime observers had very little doubt about who had ordered the hit. The assassination had all the signatures of Carmine's strategic approach to violence: careful planning, precise execution, and timing designed to maximize both the immediate impact and the long-term effect of scaring off other potential enemies. The death of Crazy Joe Gallo effectively ended the last significant internal challenge to Carmine's leadership of the Colombo family. With his most dangerous enemy eliminated and his authority firmly established, Carmine was now free to focus on expanding the family's criminal enterprises and strengthening its position within the larger organized crime landscape. With internal opposition gone and law enforcement pressure manageable, the mid-1970s represented a period of major expansion and diversification for the Colombo family under Carmine's leadership. The traditional rackets that had been the foundation of the organization's income for decades, numbers running, loan sharking, labor racketeering, continued to generate substantial profits. But Carmine was also exploring new criminal opportunities that showed his understanding of changing economic and social conditions. One of the most profitable new areas was drug trafficking, particularly bringing in and distributing heroin from Sicily and other Mediterranean sources. Carmine approached drug trafficking with the same organized, step-by-step method that he applied to all criminal enterprises. He established secure supply lines, reliable distribution networks, and sophisticated money laundering operations that kept the risk of detection as low as possible while maximizing profits. But drug trafficking also represented a significant break from traditional mafia practices and values. Many older organized crime figures viewed dealing drugs as beneath their dignity and potentially dangerous to the organization's long-term security. The profits were enormous, but so were the potential penalties and the coyotes. Business attracted a level of law enforcement attention that made other criminal activities more difficult to conduct. Carmine's approach to this dilemma showed his leadership style perfectly. He kept very strict separation between drug operations and other family activities. He used non-Italian associates to handle the most dangerous aspects of the business, and he made sure that he was shielded from direct involvement in day-to-day drug trafficking operations. This strategy let the family profit from the drug trade while keeping the risks to its core, leadership and traditional criminal enterprises, as low as possible. Another area of expansion was white-collar crime, particularly stock market fraud, credit card fraud, and various types of financial manipulation. These activities required different skills and resources than traditional organized crime enterprises, but they also offered the potential for enormous profits with relatively low risks of violent confrontation or long prison sentences. Carmine's success in these areas showed his ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the fundamental advantages that had made organized crime families successful in the first place. Discipline, loyalty, access to violence when necessary, and the ability to corrupt legitimate institutions and individuals when corruption served their purposes. By the mid-1970s, Carmine had established himself as one of the most powerful and respected figures in American organized crime. His success in leading the Colombo family through a period of significant challenges and his reputation for strategic intelligence and effective leadership had earned him recognition from his peers in other crime families, and a place in the informal council of bosses that governed organized crime. Activities throughout the New York area, the Commission, the governing body of American organized crime that had been established in the 1930s to resolve disputes between families and coordinate major criminal enterprises, had evolved significantly since its founding, where it had once been dominated by a small number of powerful bosses who could make decisions and enforce them throughout their organizations. It now functioned more like a corporate board of directors with complex relationships between multiple families and constantly shifting alliances based on business interests and personal relationships. Carmine's participation in commission activities during this period gave him valuable insights into the larger strategic challenges facing organized crime in America. The traditional advantages that had made mafia families so successful: ethnic solidarity, family-based loyalty structures, connections to legitimate businesses and political institutions, were being worn away by changing population patterns, increased law enforcement sophistication, and new forms of criminal competition from non-Italian organizations. At the same time, new opportunities were emerging that required the kind of resources and coordination that could only be provided by large, well-organized criminal enterprises. International drug trafficking sophisticated financial fraud, and labor racketeering in expanding industries all offered enormous profit potential for organizations that could operate on a national and international scale. Carmine's contribution to commission deliberations was typically strategic and forward-thinking. He argued for keeping traditional organizational structures and values while changing tactics and operations to take advantage of new opportunities and respond to new challenges. He also pushed for improved intelligence sharing between families and better coordination of responses to law enforcement pressure. But his most important insight was his recognition that the old model of territorial monopolies and ethnic exclusivity was becoming outdated. The future would belong to criminal organizations that could operate across traditional boundaries, form alliances with non-Italian criminals when necessary, and adapt their structures and methods to changing conditions while maintaining their core advantages of discipline, loyalty, and strategic intelligence. The demands of leading a major, organized crime family during one of the most challenging periods in its history took a significant toll on Carmine's personal life and relationships. The constant stress of managing complex criminal enterprises while avoiding law enforcement attention, keeping discipline within the organization, and responding to threats from rivals required an almost superhuman level of focus and energy. Carmine's marriage, which had survived the challenges of his early criminal career, started to show signs of strain under the pressures of his leadership responsibilities. His wife increasingly found herself isolated from normal social relationships because of her husband's criminal activities and reputation. Their children were growing up in an atmosphere of constant tension and potential danger. The security measures that were necessary to protect Carmine from his enemies also created barriers between him and the normal world that most people just took for granted. He could not travel freely. He could not maintain regular social relationships. He could not participate in many of the ordinary activities that give meaning and pleasure to most people's lives. In many ways, his success as a criminal leader had made him a prisoner of his own achievements. These personal costs were made worse by the increasing isolation that came with leadership at the highest levels of organized crime. The combination of law enforcement pressure and the constant possibility of betrayal by subordinates or rivals meant that Carmine could never be entirely sure who he could trust. Even his closest associates and oldest friends were potential threats who had to be watched and evaluated constantly. But perhaps the greatest personal cost was the psychological impact of the violence. That was an inevitable part of his chosen profession. Carmine had been involved in numerous killings and had ordered many others during his rise to power. While he had learned to compartmentalize these experiences and function effectively despite them, they had left their mark on his personality and his relationships with others. The man who had earned the nickname the Snake for his patience and strategic intelligence was becoming increasingly paranoid and suspicious. These qualities served him well in his criminal career, but they made normal human relationships increasingly difficult to maintain. The very characteristics that had made him so successful as a criminal leader were gradually isolating him from the world beyond organized crime. As the 1970s drew to a close, Carmine Persico had achieved everything that he had dreamed of during his early years on the streets of Brooklyn. He was the undisputed leader of a major crime family. He commanded respect throughout the organized crime community. He controlled criminal enterprises worth tens of millions of dollars. But success had come at a price that was only beginning to become clear as he entered the most challenging phase of his career. The 1980s would bring new laws, new investigative techniques, and new forms of law enforcement pressure that would test all of his accumulated skills and experience. The federal government was preparing to launch the most comprehensive attack on organized crime in American history. using RICO prosecutions and sophisticated surveillance techniques to attack the very foundations of mafia power. And right at the center of this campaign would be Carmine the Snake Persico, whose success and prominence had made him one of the government's highest priority targets. January 1981, in a dingy social club on President Street in Brooklyn, surrounded by the familiar faces of men who had followed him through decades of criminal enterprise, Carmine John Persico Jr. was officially recognized as the boss of the Colombo crime family. The ceremony was simple but significant. Joseph Colombo Sr. had died the previous year, finally succumbing to the injuries he had sustained in the 1971 shooting. The family's leadership structure needed to be formally updated to show the reality of Carmine's control. The transition was smooth from an organizational standpoint. Carmine had been effectively running the family for nearly a decade, and his authority was unquestioned by the soldiers, capos, and associates who made up the organization's membership. But official recognition as boss also meant official responsibility for the family's actions and official visibility to law enforcement, agencies that were starting to focus unprecedented attention on organized crime leadership. By 1981, the federal government's approach to organized crime had evolved significantly from the relatively ineffective efforts of previous decades. The passage of RICO in 1970 had given prosecutors powerful new tools for attacking criminal organizations, and a new generation of federal agents and attorneys was learning to use those tools with increasing sophistication and effectiveness. The FBI's organized crime program had been transformed from a relatively small, underfunded effort into a major law enforcement priority with substantial funding and political support. New surveillance technologies, electronic listening devices, long-range photography, sophisticated financial investigation techniques were being used against mafia families with growing success. For Carmine, becoming the official boss of the Colombo family meant stepping directly into the crosshairs of this enhanced law enforcement effort. His every move would be watched, his communications would be monitored, his associations would be analyzed for evidence that could be used in future prosecutions. The very success that had brought him to this position of power had also made him one of the government's highest priority targets. Throughout the early 1980s, one of the most lucrative criminal enterprises controlled by the Colombo family was its involvement in the concrete industry that was fueling New York City's construction boom. Along with the other major crime families, the Colombos had established a virtual monopoly over concrete contracts for major construction projects. Using a combination of legitimate business relationships, political corruption, and the threat of violence to control this enormously profitable market, the operation was sophisticated and systematic. Crime family associates had invested in or gained control of numerous concrete companies, cement suppliers, and construction-related businesses throughout the New York area. When major construction projects required concrete work, the families would coordinate their bids to ensure that the contracts went to companies they controlled at prices that included substantial hidden profits for the organizations. Carmine's role in this enterprise showed his evolution from street-level criminal to sophisticated business executive. He participated in regular meetings with representatives of other crime families to coordinate bidding strategies, resolve disputes over territory and contracts, and plan responses to potential law enforcement interference. These meetings, which took place in restaurants, social clubs, and private homes throughout the New York area, represented the kind of interstate criminal conspiracy that RICO had been specifically designed to address. But the concrete racket also showed the challenges that organized crime families faced in adapting to changing economic and legal conditions. The enormous profits generated by the scheme inevitably attracted law enforcement attention, and the interstate nature of the conspiracy made it vulnerable to federal prosecution under multiple legal theories. More importantly, the concrete racket required extensive documentation and record-keeping that created a paper trail of criminal activity. Unlike traditional organized crime enterprises that relied primarily on cash transactions and verbal agreements, the construction industry required contracts, invoices, bank transfers, and other documents that could be analyzed by investigators and used as evidence in criminal prosecutions. Carmine understood these vulnerabilities, but the profits from the concrete racket were too substantial to abandon, and the family's investment in the necessary infrastructure was too significant to just write off. His solution was to keep very strict separation between the family's involvement in the concrete industry and its other criminal enterprises, and to make sure that he was shielded from direct involvement in the day-to-day operations that were most likely to create incriminating evidence. In 1983, the federal government launched what would become known as the Commission Case. This was the most ambitious and comprehensive prosecution of organized crime leadership in American history. The investigation targeted the top leadership of New York's 5 major crime families: the Gambinos, Genoveses, Lucchese's, Bonanos, and Colombos, for their participation in the commission that governed organized crime activities throughout the region. The case was based on extensive surveillance, electronic eavesdropping, and financial investigation that had been conducted over several years. Federal agents had managed to place listening devices in social clubs, restaurants, and even private homes where crime family leaders conducted their business. The conversations recorded by these devices provided unprecedented insights into the structure, operations, and decision-making processes of organized crime families. For Carmine, the commission case represented the culmination of everything he had feared about increased law enforcement attention and sophistication. The government had recorded conversations in which he discussed criminal enterprises, planned illegal activities, and coordinated with other crime family leaders. More importantly, the prosecution was using RECO to argue that his participation in the commission itself constituted membership in a criminal conspiracy. Regardless of whether specific criminal acts could be proven, the strategic challenge facing Carmine was unlike anything he had confronted during his criminal career. Previous law enforcement efforts had focused on specific crimes, murders, robberies, extortions, that could be defended against by challenging evidence, providing alibis, or discrediting witnesses. The commission case was attacking the fundamental structure of organized crime, arguing that leadership roles in crime families were inherently criminal, and that participation in the commission constituted ongoing criminal conspiracy regardless of specific acts. As the legal pressure intensified throughout the mid-1980s, Carmine faced a personal dilemma that showed the larger challenges confronting organized crime families in America. His son, Alphonse, who everyone called Alley Boy, had grown up in the shadow of his father's criminal empire and had gradually become involved in family activities as he reached adulthood. Alphonse represented both the promise and the danger of hereditary succession in organized crime. He had inherited his father's intelligence and strategic thinking, and he had earned respect from family members through his own accomplishments, not just by relying on his family name. But he had also inherited the burden of law enforcement attention and the expectation that he would eventually take on leadership responsibilities that were becoming increasingly dangerous. For Carmine, watching his son follow the same path that had brought him both success and suffering was a source of both pride and anguish. He had built a criminal empire that could provide wealth, power, and respect for future generations of his family. But he had also created a legacy of violence and criminality that almost guaranteed that his children would face the same dangers and moral compromises that had defined his own life. The father-son relationship was further complicated by the different generational perspectives on organized crime and its future prospects. Carmine had come of age during what many consider the golden age of American organized crime. This was when mafia families commanded genuine respect and fear, when law enforcement was relatively ineffective, and when the rewards of criminal leadership clearly outweighed the risks. Alphonse was entering the criminal world at a time when those advantages were rapidly disappearing. RICO prosecutions were decimating the leadership of crime families throughout the country. Electronic surveillance had made traditional methods of communication and organization extremely dangerous. New forms of criminal competition from non-Italian organizations were challenging the monopolies that had made mafia families so profitable. Despite these challenges, the bond between father and son remained strong, and Carmine began gradually transferring more responsibilities to Alphonse as the legal pressure on his own position intensified. The transition was handled carefully, with extensive coaching and mentoring designed to prepare the younger man for the complex challenges he would face as a leader in an increasingly difficult environment. December 16, 1985, the evening rush hour in Manhattan was in full swing as commuters hurried through the streets, eager to finish their Christmas shopping and get home to their families. Outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street, Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino crime family, stepped out of his Lincoln Continental with his driver and bodyguard, Thomas Bilotti, preparing for what he expected to be a routine dinner meeting with other family members. Castellano was one of the most powerful organized crime figures in America. He controlled a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars and commanded the shears loyalty of hundreds of soldiers and associates throughout the New York area. At 70 years old, he had survived decades in a profession where most men died young or spent their lives in prison. His longevity and success had made him a legendary figure in the criminal underworld. But success had also made him a target. As Castellano and Bilotti approached the restaurant, 3 gunmen wearing light-colored trench coats and dark fur hats emerged from the crowd of pedestrians and opened fire with semi-automatic pistols. The attack was swift, brutal, and efficiently executed. Both men were dead within seconds, their bodies lying in pools of blood on the sidewalk as the gunmen melted back into the crowd and disappeared. The assassination of Paul Castellano sent shockwaves throughout the organized crime community. Killing the boss of a major crime family was an extraordinarily dangerous undertaking that violated numerous traditional codes and customs. The perpetrators had to be supremely confident in their ability to succeed and to survive the inevitable retaliation from Castellano's supporters and allies. Within hours of the shooting, word spread through the criminal underground that John Gotti, an ambitious capo in the Gambino family, had orchestrated the assassination with the support of several other family members who were dissatisfied with Castellano's leadership. The successful coup transformed Gotti from a relatively unknown middle-level criminal into one of the most powerful and feared bosses in America. For Carmine, the Castellano assassination represented both an opportunity and a threat. Gotti's rise to power had eliminated a potential rival and created new possibilities for alliances and cooperation between the Gambino and Colombo families. But the brazen nature of the hit and Gotti's flamboyant personality also threatened to attract the kind of media and law enforcement attention that could make life more difficult for all organized crime families. Carmine's response to the changing dynamics was characteristically cautious and strategic. He maintained cordial relations with the new Gambino leadership while avoiding any actions that could be interpreted as taking sides in internal Gambino disputes. At the same time, he used his intelligence network to monitor developments within the Gambino organization and assess how those developments might affect his own family's interests. As the commission case moved toward trial in 1986, Carmine faced the most serious legal challenge of his criminal career. The government had assembled what prosecutors described as overwhelming evidence of his participation in organized crime activities. This included recorded conversations, financial records, and testimony from cooperating witnesses who had worked closely with the Colombo family. Carmine's approach to defending against these charges showed both his strategic intelligence and his deep understanding of the American legal system, rather than simply denying the charges or claiming innocence. He developed a sophisticated legal strategy that challenged the government's use of RICO, QUESTIONED, the reliability of electronic surveillance evidence, and attacked the credibility of cooperating witnesses. One of his most innovative tactics was his decision to represent himself in court rather than relying solely on traditional criminal defense attorneys. This decision was based on his belief that he understood the facts of his case better than any lawyer possibly could, and that his own presentation might be more effective than conventional legal representation. The decision to act as his own attorney was extremely risky. Criminal trials are complex proceedings that require extensive legal knowledge and courtroom experience. Defendants who represent themselves are often at a severe disadvantage compared to trained prosecutors who have spent years learning how to present evidence effectively and persuade juries. But Carmine's intelligence, charisma, and deep knowledge of the case facts made him potentially more effective than many professional attorneys might have been. His courtroom performance became legendary within legal circles. He demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of constitutional law, evidence rules, and trial procedures that surprised prosecutors and impressed observers. His cross-examination of government witnesses was particularly effective as he used his intimate knowledge of organized crime activities to identify inconsistencies and contradictions in their testimony. But perhaps most importantly, Carmine's decision to represent himself was a powerful symbolic statement about his attitude toward the charges and the legal system more generally. By taking personal responsibility for his defense, he was demonstrating the same kind of leadership and personal courage that had made him successful as a crime boss. He was refusing to hide behind lawyers or legal technicalities, and instead was confronting his accusers directly. November 19, 1986, after deliberating for several days, the jury in the commission case returned guilty verdicts against all the defendants, including Carmine. The convictions represented a historic victory for federal prosecutors and a devastating blow to organized crime leadership throughout New York. For Carmine, a guilty verdict meant the end of his career as an active crime boss and the beginning of what would likely be the rest of his life in federal prison. The sentence, 100 years in federal prison, was designed to ensure that he would never again be able to participate in organized crime activities or threaten public safety. But the conviction also represented something more significant than just another criminal prosecution. It marked the end of an era in American organized crime when powerful bosses could operate with relative impunity, and when traditional mafia families commanded genuine respect and fear throughout the criminal underworld. The success of the commission case demonstrated that the federal government had finally developed the legal tools, investigative techniques, and political will necessary to attack organized crime at its highest levels. RICO prosecutions, electronic surveillance, and cooperating witness programs had proven effective against even the most sophisticated and security-conscious criminal organizations. For the Colombo family, Carmine's conviction created an immediate leadership crisis. The organization had been built around his personal authority and strategic vision, and his removal from active leadership left a power vacuum that would be difficult to fill. Alphonse Persico was the logical successor, but he lacked his father's experience and reputation, and he would be operating in an environment that was far more dangerous and challenging than the one his father had navigated during his rise to power. Carmine's response to his conviction was characteristically defiant and strategic. Even as he prepared to enter federal prison, he continued to make plans for the family's future and to position loyal subordinates to maintain organizational stability and effectiveness during his absence. He also began developing strategies for continuing to influence family operations from prison using visits, coded messages, and intermediaries to maintain his authority despite his physical removal from day-to-day activities. Carmine's arrival at the federal penitentiary in Marion, Illinois in 1987 marked the beginning of a new phase in his criminal career. Marion was one of the most secure federal prisons in America. It was designed to house the most dangerous and escape-prone inmates in the federal system. The facility's strict security measures and limited communication privileges were specifically designed to prevent organized crime figures from continuing to run their criminal enterprises from behind bars. But Carmine approached prison with the same strategic intelligence and adaptability that had made him successful on the streets. Rather than being discouraged by the restrictions and limitations of prison life, he began systematically developing methods for maintaining contact with his organization and continuing to influence its operations. Despite the physical barriers that separated him from his subordinates, his first challenge was establishing reliable communication channels between the prison and the outside world. Federal authorities monitored all telephone calls and mail, and visits were strictly controlled and supervised. But Carmine gradually developed a network of intermediaries, attorneys, family members, and trusted associates who could relay messages and information between him and the family's active leadership. The system was sophisticated and difficult for authorities to detect or disrupt. Messages were often coded or embedded in seemingly innocent communications about family matters or legal issues. Important decisions were communicated through multiple channels to ensure that they reached their intended recipients, even if some communications were intercepted or compromised. Perhaps more importantly, Carmine established his authority within the prison itself. Despite being confined in one of America's most secure facilities, he gradually built a reputation among both inmates and staff as someone who commanded respect and wielded significant influence. This reputation enhanced his ability to protect himself from potential enemies and to gather information about law enforcement activities that might affect his family's operations. His success as a prison leader also demonstrated the fundamental qualities that had made him effective as a crime boss: intelligence, strategic thinking, the ability to form alliances and build loyalty, and an intuitive understanding of power dynamics and human psychology. Even in the artificial environment of federal prison, these qualities remained valuable and effective. While Carmine worked to maintain his influence from prison, the Colombo family faced increasing challenges in the outside world. Law enforcement pressure continued to intensify throughout the late 1980s, with regular arrests of family members and associates disrupting traditional criminal operations and creating constant security concerns. Alphonse Persico's efforts to assume leadership of the family were complicated by his lack of experience and by questions about his ability to fill his father's shoes. While he was clearly intelligent and capable, he had not yet proven himself through the kind of major challenges and crises that had established his father's reputation and authority. The family's criminal enterprises were also being affected by broader changes in the organized crime landscape. Traditional activities like numbers running were being displaced by state lotteries. Labor racketeering was becoming more difficult as union membership declined and government oversight increased. Even drug trafficking was becoming more competitive as non-Italian criminal organizations gained strength and sophistication. At the same time, the success of RICO prosecutions was creating a climate of fear and suspicion within organized crime families throughout the country. The threat of lengthy prison sentences was encouraging more criminals to cooperate with law enforcement, and the knowledge that anyone could potentially become an informant was making it increasingly difficult to maintain the trust and loyalty that were essential for effective criminal organizations. For Carmine, watching these developments from prison was both frustrating and educational. He could see the challenges facing his organization, but his ability to respond to them was severely limited by his confinement. The experience reinforced his belief that successful leadership required direct personal involvement and constant adaptation to changing circumstances, qualities that were extremely difficult to maintain from behind bars. But it also demonstrated his remarkable resilience and determination. Despite facing what most people would consider insurmountable obstacles, Carmine continued to plan for the future, to look for opportunities within constraints, and to maintain his commitment to the organization and the people who depended on his leadership. As the 1980s drew to a close, Carmine Persico had been transformed from one of America's most powerful crime bosses into a federal prisoner serving what amounted to a life sentence. The empire he had built over decades had been severely damaged by law enforcement pressure and the world of organized crime that had made his success possible was changing in fundamental ways. But the man who had earned the nickname the Snake for his patience, cunning, and ability to strike when least expected was far from finished. The next decade would bring new challenges and new opportunities, and Carmine would demonstrate once again that his capacity for adaptation and survival was matched by few others in the history of American organized crime. The 1990s began with Carmine Persico facing the stark reality of life imprisonment. But his response to this seemingly hopeless situation demonstrated the qualities that had made him one of the most successful organized crime figures in American history. Rather than accepting defeat or withdrawing from active involvement in criminal activities, he began developing sophisticated methods for maintaining control of the Colombo family from behind the walls of federal prison. The challenge was unprecedented in its complexity. Federal authorities were well aware of Carmine's reputation and capabilities, and they had implemented extensive security measures, specifically designed to prevent him from communicating with his criminal organization. All telephone calls were monitored and recorded. All mail was read and analyzed. All visits were supervised and limited. The prison itself was designed to be escape-proof, and Carmine was classified as one of the most dangerous inmates in the entire federal system. But Carmine's approach to these obstacles showed the same strategic intelligence that had served him throughout his criminal career. Rather than attempting to overcome the security measures directly, he systematically developed methods for working within and around them. His strategy was based on patience, careful planning, and the recognition that small advantages could be accumulated over time to create significant capabilities. One of his most effective innovations was the development of what intelligence analysts would later describe as a cellular communication system. Instead of relying on direct communication between himself and family members, Carmine created a network of intermediaries who could relay messages and information through multiple layers of contacts. This system was more secure than direct communication because it was extremely difficult for law enforcement to monitor all the potential communication channels, and because each individual contact had only limited knowledge of the overall operation. The system worked through a combination of attorney visits, family communications, and coded messages embedded in seemingly innocent correspondence. Carmine's legal team, which continued to work on appeals and other legal matters, served as one communication channel. Family members, who were not involved in criminal activities, served as another. Trusted associates who were not under active law enforcement surveillance served as a third. Messages were often highly coded and required extensive knowledge of family history, personalities, and operations to interpret correctly. A seemingly innocent comment about someone's health might actually contain instructions about a criminal enterprise. A reference to a family celebration might include information about law enforcement activities. A complaint about prison conditions might convey strategic guidance about ongoing disputes or opportunities. As Carmine worked to maintain his influence from prison, his son Alphonse gradually assumed greater responsibility for the day-to-day operations of the Colombo family. The transition was delicate and challenging, requiring Alphonse to establish his own authority and credibility, while maintaining continuity with his father's leadership style and strategic vision. Alphonse faced several significant disadvantages in this process. He was relatively young and inexperienced compared to some of the family's veteran capos and soldiers. He had not yet proven himself through the kind of major challenges and crises that had established his father's reputation. He was operating in an environment where law enforcement pressure was more intense and sophisticated than anything previous generations of organized crime figures had encountered. But Alphonse also had certain advantages that helped him navigate these challenges successfully. He had inherited his father's intelligence and strategic thinking abilities. He had been carefully groomed for leadership and had extensive knowledge of the family's operations and personnel. Most importantly, he had his father's continued guidance and support, even if that support had to be provided through indirect and carefully concealed channels. The relationship between father and son during this period was complex and emotionally charged. Carmine was proud of Alphonse's accomplishments and grateful for his loyalty. But he was also deeply concerned about the dangers his son was facing and the sacrifices he was making to continue the family's criminal enterprises. The older man's own experience had taught him that success in organized crime inevitably came with enormous personal costs, and he was torn between his desire to see his legacy continued and his paternal instincts to protect his son from harm. For Alphonse, the burden of leadership was made heavier by the knowledge that his every action was being scrutinized not only by law enforcement and rival criminals, but also by his imprisoned father, whose approval and respect were essential to his sense of personal identity and self-worth. The younger man was not simply running a criminal organization. He was attempting to live up to the reputation and expectations created by one of the most legendary figures in the history of American organized crime. Despite these pressures, Alphonse proved to be a competent and effective leader. He maintained discipline within the family's ranks. He adapted to changing law enforcement tactics. He identified new criminal opportunities that helped make up for the decline in traditional organized crime enterprises. Most importantly, he preserved the essential character and culture of the organization while making the tactical adjustments necessary for survival in an increasingly hostile environment. In 1991, the stability that Carmine had worked so hard to maintain within the Colombo family was shattered by the emergence of a new internal conflict that would prove to be even more destructive than the Gallo Wars of the 1960s. The new war began when Victor Orena, a longtime family capo who had been serving as acting boss during Alphonse's legal difficulties, decided to challenge the Persico family's control of the organization. Orena's challenge was based on both practical and personal considerations. From a practical standpoint, he argued that the Persico family's legal problems had made them ineffective leaders who were no longer capable of protecting the organization's interests or advancing its members' careers. Carmine's imprisonment and Alphonse's frequent legal difficulties had created instability and uncertainty that was damaging the family's criminal enterprises and relationships with other organizations. From a personal standpoint, Orena resented being treated as a temporary caretaker rather than being recognized as the family's legitimate leader. He had successfully managed the organization's operations for several years and believed that he had earned the right to permanent leadership recognition. He was also frustrated by what he saw as the Persico family's bossy management style and their reluctance to share power with other family members. The conflict escalated rapidly from political maneuvering to open violence. Both sides began recruiting supporters and preparing for warfare, and the family's criminal enterprises were disrupted as members were forced to choose sides in the dispute. The situation was further complicated by law enforcement pressure as federal agents and prosecutors saw the internal conflict as an opportunity to gather intelligence and potentially turn family members into cooperating witnesses for Carmine. Watching this conflict develop from prison was both infuriating and heartbreaking. He had spent decades building and maintaining the organization's stability and discipline, and seeing it torn apart by internal warfare represented the potential destruction of everything he had worked to achieve. More personally, the conflict was putting his son and other family members in mortal danger, and his ability to protect them was severely limited by his confinement. Carmine's response to the crisis demonstrated both his continued strategic capabilities and the limitations imposed by his imprisonment. Working through his network of intermediaries, he attempted to rally support for Alphonse and to undermine Orena's challenge to family leadership. He also tried to negotiate a peaceful resolution to the conflict, using his reputation and influence to encourage both sides to step back from open warfare. But the conflict had developed its own momentum, and both sides had accumulated grievances and commitments that made compromise increasingly difficult. The violence escalated throughout 1991 and 1992 with multiple shootings, bombings, and assassination attempts disrupting not only the Colombo family, but the entire New York organized crime community. The Second Colombo War proved to be far more destructive than the Gallo conflict of the 1960s. While the earlier war had been primarily a struggle between the established family leadership and a rebellious faction, the Orena conflict divided the family more evenly and involved a larger number of participants. The violence was also more intense and indiscriminate, with both sides employing tactics that violated traditional organized crime codes and customs. By the time the conflict finally ended in 1993, more than a dozen family members and associates had been killed, and many others had been wounded, imprisoned, or forced to flee the New York area. The family's criminal enterprises had been severely disrupted, and its reputation within the broader organized crime community had been badly damaged. Most tragically for Carmine, several longtime friends and associates had been killed in the fighting, and his son Alphonse had been wounded in an assassination attempt. The war's conclusion was brought about not by a negotiated settlement or military victory, but by law enforcement intervention. Federal prosecutors used RICO charges to indict large numbers of participants on both sides of the conflict, effectively ending the fighting by removing the combatants from the streets. Victor Orena and several of his key supporters were sentenced to life imprisonment, while Alphonse and many Persico loyalists also faced lengthy prison terms. For Carmine, the war's aftermath represented both vindication and tragedy. His family had ultimately prevailed in the struggle for control of the organization, and Alphonse had demonstrated the outlet, courage, and leadership qualities necessary to command respect from the family's membership. But the victory had come at an enormous cost in lives, resources, and organizational stability that would take years to repair. The experience also reinforced Carmine's growing recognition that the world of organized crime was changing in fundamental ways that made traditional family structures and methods increasingly outdated. The kind of internal warfare that had once been resolved through negotiation or limited violence was now likely to result in RICO prosecutions that could destroy entire organizations. The loyalty and discipline that had once been the foundation of mafia families were being worn away by law enforcement pressure and the threat of lengthy prison sentences. Despite the devastation caused by the Orena War, the Colombo family survived as a functioning criminal organization, though in a much reduced form. Under Alphonse's leadership, the remaining members adapted to their new circumstances by developing more sophisticated security measures, more decentralized operational structures, and more diverse criminal enterprises. The family's approach to criminal activities became more selective and strategic. Instead of maintaining large-scale operations that required extensive manpower and coordination, they focused on smaller, more profitable enterprises that could be conducted with minimal risk of detection or disruption. Traditional activities like loan sharking and illegal gambling continued, but they were supplemented by newer forms of crime, like credit card fraud, identity theft, and various forms of white-collar crime. The organizational structure also evolved to show the new realities of law enforcement, pressure, and the need for enhanced security. Instead of maintaining the traditional hierarchical structure with clearly defined roles and responsibilities, the family adopted a more flexible approach that allowed for rapid adaptation to changing circumstances and reduced the risk that the loss of key individuals would paralyze the entire organization. Communication methods became more sophisticated and secure, incorporating lessons learned from Carmine's experience with maintaining contact from prison. The family developed multiple communication channels, extensive use of coded language, and careful separation of information to minimize the risk of law enforcement penetration or the damage that could be caused by cooperating witnesses. For Carmine, watching these adaptations from prison was both encouraging and sobering. He was proud of his son's ability to learn from experience and adapt to changing circumstances. But he was also aware that each adaptation represented a departure from the traditional methods and values that had made organized crime families successful for generations. The organization that Alphonse was leading was still recognizably the Colombo family, but it was also something fundamentally different from the organization that Carmine had built and led during its peak years. As Carmine entered his 70s, the realities of long-term imprisonment began to take an increasing toll on his physical health and mental well-being. Decades of confinement in maximum security facilities had isolated him from the normal human relationships and experiences that give meaning and purpose to most people's lives. The constant stress of maintaining his influence over criminal activities while avoiding detection by prison authorities had exhausted even his remarkable reserves of energy and determination. But even as his physical capabilities declined, Carmine's intellectual abilities and strategic insights remained sharp. He continued to analyze developments in organized crime, law enforcement, and the broader society, and his assessments and predictions were still valued by family members and associates who managed to maintain contact with him. His reputation within the federal prison system had also continued to grow, and he was widely recognized as one of the most influential and respected inmates in the entire system. The relationship with his son Alphonse remained central to Carmine's sense of purpose and identity during these final years. Despite the difficulties of communication and the constant threat of law enforcement surveillance, father and son maintained their bond and continued to share information, advice, and mutual support. For Carmine, knowing that his legacy was being preserved and continued by someone he trusted and loved, provided some compensation for the personal sacrifices that his choices had required. But the relationship was also a source of ongoing pain and regret. Carmine could see that Alphonse was facing many of the same challenges and dangers that had defined his own criminal career, and he was increasingly aware that his decision to involve his son in organized crime activities had condemned the younger man to a life of constant risk, legal jeopardy, and moral compromise. As the new millennium approached, Carmine began to think more carefully about his life and career and about the larger changes that had transformed organized crime during his decades of involvement. The world that had made his success possible, the world of neighborhood-based ethnic communities, corrupt political machines, and relatively ineffective law enforcement, had largely disappeared. The new world of sophisticated surveillance technology, RICO prosecutions, and global criminal competition required different skills and different strategies than those that had served him so well during his rise to power. The first decade of the new millennium brought increasing health problems for Carmine as the combined effects of age, stress, and decades of imprisonment began to show up in serious medical conditions. He suffered from heart disease, diabetes, and various other ailments that were common among elderly prison inmates, but which were particularly dangerous for someone at his age and in his circumstances. Despite these health challenges, Carmine remained mentally alert and continued to maintain his influence within both the prison community and the remnants of his criminal organization. His reputation for intelligence, strategic thinking, and personal toughness had only grown during his years of imprisonment, and he was widely regarded as a living legend among both criminals and law enforcement personnel. The legend was made even stronger by his continued refusal to cooperate with law enforcement or to provide information about his criminal activities or associates. Despite facing a life sentence, and despite numerous opportunities to reduce his punishment by becoming a government witness, Carmine maintained the code of silence that had governed his entire criminal career. This consistency earned him respect even from his enemies and reinforced his status as one of the last representatives of an older, more disciplined approach to organized crime. During these years, Carmine also began to wrestle more seriously with the moral and ethical implications of his life choices. While he never publicly expressed regret for his criminal activities or acknowledged that his actions had harmed innocent people, those who knew him well detected signs that he was struggling with questions about the meaning and value of his life's work. The struggle was particularly evident in his relationship with his grandchildren, who represented both the continuation of his family line and the possibility of a different kind of legacy. Unlike his own children, who had grown up immersed in the criminal world, his grandchildren had opportunities to pursue legitimate careers and normal lives. For Carmine, their success in conventional pursuits was both a source of pride and a reminder of the paths not taken in his own life. March 7, 2019. The medical unit at Duke University Medical Center was quiet in the early morning hours as Carmine John Persico Jr. drew his final breaths. At 85 years old, he had outlived most of his contemporaries and had witnessed the virtual destruction of the very criminal world that had made him famous and powerful. The man who had once commanded an army of criminals and controlled millions of dollars in illegal enterprises was dying alone. Surrounded by federal marshals rather than family and friends, the end came peacefully, a result of complications from the various health conditions that had plagued his final years. There was no dramatic last statement, no deathbed confession, no final gesture of defiance against the system that had imprisoned him for the last 3 decades of his life. Carmine the Snake Persico simply stopped breathing, bringing to a close one of the longest and most remarkable criminal careers in American history. News of his death spread quickly through both law enforcement and criminal circles, generating a mixture of relief, respect, and reflection on the man and the era he had represented. For law enforcement officials, Carmine's death marked the end of a decades-long struggle against one of the most capable and dangerous organized crime figures they had ever encountered. For criminals and former associates, it represented the loss of a legendary leader who had embodied the traditional values and methods of American organized crime at their most sophisticated and effective. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Carmine's death was what it represented for the broader evolution of organized crime in America. His passing marked the end of the generation of leaders who had built the modern American Mafia and had made it one of the most powerful and influential criminal enterprises in world history. The methods, values, and organizational structures that had made Carmine so successful had largely been made obsolete by changes in law enforcement, society, and the criminal world itself. The Colombo family continued to exist after Carmine's death, but as a shadow of its former self. Law enforcement pressure, internal conflicts, and the changing nature of criminal opportunities had reduced it to a small group of aging criminals who were more focused on avoiding prosecution than on building or maintaining a criminal empire. The era of powerful, disciplined, and effective organized crime families had effectively ended with the death of the last of the old-school bosses. Carmine the Snake Persico died as he had lived for the final decades of his life, on his own terms, never breaking the code of silence that had defined his world. In death, he achieved a kind of immortality that had eluded him in life, becoming not just a criminal who had been defeated by law enforcement, but a symbol of an entire era in American organized crime. His story is ultimately a tragedy, both personal and societal. Personal, because a man of extraordinary intelligence, courage, and leadership ability chose to use those gifts in pursuit of power and wealth through violence and intimidation, rather than through legitimate means. Societal, because the conditions that made his success possible, neighborhood-based ethnic communities, political corruption, ineffective law enforcement, showed bigger failures in American institutions and social structures. But Carmine's story is also a testament to certain human qualities that command respect even when they are employed in service of criminal ends. His loyalty to his family and organization, his refusal to betray his associates, even when cooperation might have reduced his punishment, his ability to maintain dignity and purpose, even in the face of life imprisonment. These show a kind of personal integrity that goes beyond the moral boundaries he crossed. The world that Carmine Persico helped to build, and ultimately saw destroyed, was a world where respect was earned through strength, where loyalty was the highest virtue, and where a man's word was his bond. These were not necessarily admirable values when applied to criminal enterprises, but they were authentic values that provided meaning and structure to the lives of people who lived by them. Today, more than 4 years after his death, Carmine Persico remains a figure of fascination for those who study organized crime, law enforcement, and American social history. His life stretched across nearly the entire history of modern American organized crime, from its emergence in the immigrant neighborhoods of early 20th century cities to its virtual destruction by late 20th century law enforcement campaigns. The lessons of his life are complex and sometimes contradictory. He demonstrated that intelligence, discipline, and strategic thinking could build powerful and lasting criminal organizations, but also that such organizations were ultimately vulnerable to the combined forces of law enforcement, social change, and their own internal contradictions. He showed that loyalty and courage were valuable qualities in any context, but also that they were insufficient to overcome the moral and practical problems inherent in a life dedicated to crime. Perhaps most importantly, Carmine's story reminds us that the choice between legitimate and criminal paths is often more complex than simple moral categories might suggest. The young man who earned the nickname the Snake in the streets of 1940s. Brooklyn was responding to real social and economic conditions that limited his options and shaped his understanding of how the world worked. His later success as a criminal leader reflected not just personal ambition and ruthlessness, but also genuine leadership abilities that might have been employed in service of legitimate institutions under different circumstances. In the end, Carmine the Snake Persico was a man of his time and place, shaped by the specific conditions of mid-20th century urban America and the opportunities and limitations that those conditions created. He made choices that brought him power, wealth, and respect within a particular world, but also condemned him to a life of violence, imprisonment, and ultimate irrelevance as that world disappeared around him. The streets that made him eventually claimed him, but not in the way that most observers would have predicted. He was not killed by rivals or betrayed by associates. He was outlived by history itself. The criminal empire he built was not destroyed by a more powerful enemy, but made obsolete by changes in law enforcement, technology, and society that made his methods and values increasingly ineffective. Carmine Persico's legacy is the legacy of American organized crime itself, a story of remarkable achievement and ultimate failure, of genuine human qualities employed in service of destructive ends, and of the complex relationship between individual choices and social conditions. His death marked not just the end of a criminal career, but the end of an era in American history when such careers were possible and, for some, almost inevitable. The most dangerous snakes, as he himself once said, are the ones you never see coming. But even the most dangerous snakes are ultimately subject to changes in their environment that they cannot control or predict. Carmine the Snake Persico was a master of adaptation and survival, but in the end, even his remarkable abilities could not overcome the forces that were transforming the world around him. His story serves as both a warning about the costs of choosing criminal paths and a complicated meditation on the nature of power, loyalty, and leadership in American society. The young man who began his career as a street fighter in Red Hook became one of the most sophisticated and successful criminal leaders in American history, but he also became a prisoner of the very success that had made him legendary. In the shadows of Brooklyn, where loyalty was currency and betrayal meant death, Carmine the Snake Persico had indeed risen from the streets to become the most feared boss in Colombo family history. But his empire crumbled not from bullets or betrayal, as the opening of his story had predicted, but from something far more unstoppable: the passage of time and the evolution of the world around him. This snake had finally met an enemy he could not outmaneuver, outwit, or outlast. History itself had proven to be the most dangerous adversary of all, patient and relentless, waiting decades to strike the final blow, and in the end, even the most cunning serpent could not escape the ultimate fate that awaits all who choose to live by violence, to be consumed by the very forces they had helped create. Carmine Persico died as he had lived in his later years, alone, confined, but unbroken. The last of the old-school bosses had taken his secrets with him to the grave, leaving behind only the legend of the snake and the mighty warning of an empire built on blood and loyalty that ultimately proved as mortal as the man who had created it. The streets of Brooklyn continued their eternal rhythm, but they would never again produce a figure quite like Carmine the Snake Persico. The conditions that had made his rise possible, the neighborhood loyalties, the ethnic solidarity, the relative weakness of law enforcement, the opportunities for advancement through violence and cunning, had all passed into history, along with the man who had mastered them so completely. In death, as in life, Carmine Persico remained an enigma, a man capable of extraordinary loyalty and breathtaking betrayal, of strategic brilliance and moral blindness, of building lasting institutions and destroying human lives. He was in the end both more and less than the sum of his crimes. A figure who embodied the contradictions and complexities of American organized crime at its most sophisticated and most destructive. The snake had finally shed its last skin, leaving behind only the empty shell of a legend and the enduring questions about the nature of power, the meaning of loyalty, and the price of choosing a life outside the boundaries of law and conventional morality. His story was over, but its echoes would continue to reverberate through the criminal underworld and the corridors of law enforcement for generations to come. Carmine the Snake Persico had achieved a form of immortality that he had never sought and probably never wanted. He had become not just a criminal, but a symbol of an entire era in American history, and like all symbols, he would be remembered not for the complex reality of his life and choices, but for what others chose to see in his story. Whether inspiration or warning, tragedy or triumph, the embodiment of American ambition or its ultimate corruption, the most dangerous snakes indeed are the ones you never see coming. But sometimes the most dangerous thing about a snake is not its venom or its stealth, but its ability to fascinate those who observe it from a safe distance, making them forget, if only for a moment, just how deadly and destructive such beauty can be. Carmine the Snake Persico died as he lived in his final decades, unbroken, unrepentant, and taking his secrets to the grave. His empire lasted longer than most countries, controlled more money than Fortune 500 companies, and influenced more lives than most presidents. The question is not whether he was evil or brilliant. It is what his story tells us about the America that created him. If this 3-hour deep dive into the darkest corners of American power kept you glued to your screen, imagine what other untold stories are waiting out there. Hit subscribe and tap that notification bell, because we are only just beginning with the most fascinating criminal minds in history. What grabs your attention most about Carmine Persico's story? His climb to power? His ability to rule from a prison cell? Or the way he outlasted everyone who ever tried to destroy him? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you stayed with me through this entire epic journey, you are truly committed to understanding how power actually works. So there you have it. You have just witnessed the complete rise and fall of America's last mafia emperor. The most dangerous snakes are not the ones that strike fast. They are the ones that wait, plan, and strike when you least expect it. Until next time, keep an eye on your back